The earth, in its ancient and patient wisdom, keeps countless secrets. Beneath layers of soil and stone, beneath the roots of trees that have stood witness to generations rising and fading, it guards what time has buried. Most of those secrets are harmless relics of forgotten days, a coin dropped by careless hands, a toy lost by a wandering child, a tool misplaced and never found again. Yet sometimes the ground conceals something far heavier, something hidden with intention, something meant never to be discovered again. A well, more than most places, is a silent confidant. It is a dark shaft plunging deep into the body of the land, a passage to the hidden waters that sustain life. For years, sometimes centuries, water fills its depths, masking whatever may lie at the bottom. But what happens when that water is no longer needed? What happens when the liquid veil that once concealed its depths slowly disappears, drained away until nothing remains but the dry, exposed floor beneath? When the last drop is drawn out and the ancient well stands empty under the harsh glare of sunlight, its hidden bottom finally revealed. It is in that memento when darkness retreats and what was concealed is forced into the open that the earth sometimes surrenders its most terrible truths. And in the blistering summer of 1874, in a nearly forgotten hollow of eastern Tennessee, the draining of an abandoned well in a place called Sears Creek forced an entire town to confront a secret so profound, so deeply buried, that its discovery threatened to tear apart the fragile peace the townspeople had built around themselves. They had chosen to forget. But the well, in its final reluctant act, remembered for them. Before we continue with the story of Sears Creek and the disturbing discovery that would forever change its quiet existence, take a moment to make sure you don't miss future tales from Liturgy of Fear. If you enjoy stories drawn from the darker corners of history and the mysteries buried beneath it, consider subscribing to the channel. And while you listen, share in the comments where you're watching from or what city or state you call home. Your engagement helps bring more forgotten stories to light. Children, with their innate fascination for the forbidden, would dare each other to get close, to peer into the inky blackness, to drop stones and listen for the distant echoing splash. The older folks, however, gave it a wide berth, their gazes averted, their lips pressed into thin, disapproving lines. It was a place of ill omen, a silent testament to a past no one wished to speak of. The town council, a collection of the town's most prominent and often most stubborn citizens, had finally, after years of deliberation and procrastination, voted to address the issue. The well, they decreed, had become a safety hazard. A child, a stray animal, even a careless adult, could easily fall in. It needed to be drained and filled permanently, its dark moat sealed forever. The contract for this grim task went to Thomas Grundy, a man in his early 30s, whose hands were calloused and strong, his face perpetually smudged with dirt and the honest sweat of labor. Thomas made his living sinking new wells and repairing old ones across the county, a trade that kept him busy and respected. He was a practical man, unburdened by the town's superstitions, seeing only a job to be done. On a Monday morning in mid-July, under a sky that promised another day of relentless heat, Thomas arrived at the Harrow property. He brought with him his hand pump, a sturdy, well-maintained piece of equipment, its iron gleaming dully in the morning light. He had a coil of thick hemp rope, carefully wound and smelling faintly of tar, and his young helper, a boy of 15 named Percy, whose eyes were wide with a mixture of apprehension and excitement. Percy, thin and gangly, carried a bucket of tools and a nervous energy that buzzed around him like a trapped fly. The process of draining began. It was slow, methodical work, a testament to Thomas's patience and the sheer volume of water held within the ancient shaft. The hand pump, with its rhythmic creak and groan, sucked up the brown murky water, sending it gushing out through a hose and into a ditch Thomas had dug, leading it away from the wellhead. The water was tinged with iron, leaving rust-cold stains on the parched earth and something else, something indefinable, a faint, earthy odor that was not quite unpleasant, but certainly unfamiliar. Percy, after a few hours of helping with the pump, wrinkled his nose, his young face contorted in a grimace. "Smells old, Mr. Grundy," he'd muttered, refusing to get closer to the gushing stream, preferring to stand a respectful distance away, swatting at flies and casting nervous glances at the dark opening of the well. Thomas, however, simply grunted, his focus unwavering, his strong arms working the pump handle with a steady, tireless rhythm. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He was determined to see the job through. By late Tuesday afternoon, the water level had dropped significantly, revealing the slick moss-covered stones of the well's interior, glistening darkly in the fading light. The pump continued its relentless work through the night, its creaking a lonely, persistent sound in the otherwise silent hollow. By Wednesday morning, the well ran dry. The bottom, for the first time in perhaps 40 years, was exposed. The air around the wellhead, usually cool and damp, now carried a faint, unsettling scent, a mixture of damp earth, mineral deposits, and something else, something organic and ancient, a smell that seemed to cling to the very fabric of the air. Thomas, after a moment of quiet contemplation, rigged his rope and pulley over the stone lip, securing it firmly to a nearby oak. He checked the knots twice, his movements deliberate and precise. He lit a small tin lantern, its flame flickering uncertainly in the morning breeze, and then, without a word, he went down. The town, though outwardly indifferent, held its breath. The quiet dread that had always surrounded the Harrow well was about to be given a name. The descent into the well was a journey into a different world, a world of cold stone and echoing silence. Thomas Grundy, a man accustomed to the earth's embrace, felt the shift immediately. The air grew heavy, damp, and still pressing in on him as he lowered himself hand over hand down the thick hemp rope. The rough cold stone of the well shaft scraped against his back, a constant abrasive reminder of the earth's unyielding nature. Above him the circle of sky, once vast and blue, shrank rapidly, becoming a distant shimmering coin of light, then a mere pinprick, until it was swallowed almost entirely by the encroaching darkness. The sounds of the world above, the distant chirping of cicadas, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, faded into an indistinct hum, replaced by the amplified drip of residual moisture trickling down the ancient stones and the soft rhythmic creak of the rope under his weight. The smell changed, too, subtly at first, then more profoundly as he dropped below the waterline residue. The initial scent of damp earth and mineral deposits familiar to any well digger gave way to something else. There was the metallic tang of rust, the faint earthy aroma of decaying moss, and then beneath it all, a deeper, more primal scent. It was organic, certainly, but not the fresh, vibrant smell of living things. It was the smell of things long dead, of decomposition slowed to an agonizing crawl by the cold, damp darkness. It was the smell of time itself, distilled and concentrated, a scent that seemed to seep into his very bones. He held the tin lantern out before him, its weak, flickering light struggling against the oppressive gloom, casting dancing shadows that distorted the rough-hewn stones into grotesque, fleeting shapes. The light, rather than illuminating, seemed only to emphasize the vastness of the darkness around him. Finally, his feet touched down the bottom. It was not the soft, yielding mud he might have expected, nor the rough, uneven bedrock. Instead, his boots met a surface that was surprisingly firm, almost flat. He swept the lantern's beam across the floor, his eyes adjusting to the dim, claustrophobic space. What he saw made him pause. The floor of the well was not natural bedrock at all. It had been reinforced carefully and deliberately with flat field stones laid with a precision that spoke of human hands and purposeful intent. This was unusual. Most wells once they hit water-bearing strata were left with a natural bottom or perhaps a rough lining of stones to prevent collapse. This was different. This was a floor constructed sealed. He took a step, his boots crunching softly on the fine grit that had settled over the stones. The air was still, heavy and cold, a stark contrast to the sweltering heat above. He moved slowly, methodically, his gaze sweeping over the field stones, and then he noticed it. In one section near the curved wall of the well, the stones had been disturbed, not violently, but subtly, as if they had been shifted, then replaced, but not quite perfectly. A faint, almost imperceptible seam ran between two of the larger stones. A line that seemed too deliberate, too unnatural. Something beneath them, or rather something pressed between the stones and the well wall, caught his eye. A dark, irregular shape barely visible in the lantern light. He knelt, his knees protesting slightly against the cold, damp stone. He reached out. His fingers thick and calloused from years of labor, probing the narrow crevice. His fingertips brushed against something hard, smooth, yet strangely textured. He worked his fingers deeper. His breath held a strange premonition coiling in his gut. His fingers closed around something long and curved, something that felt both fragile and unyielding. He pulled it free slowly, carefully, and held it up to the lantern's flickering light. Bone. It was undeniably bone, not the rough, irregular bone of an animal, not the splintered fragments of a deer or a rabbit. This was different. This was smooth, dense, with a distinct curvature that spoke of a larger, more complex structure. He knew the difference. He had been digging long enough, had seen enough of the earth's buried secrets to know the difference between the remains of a beast and the remains of man. A cold, creeping dread began to spread through him, a sensation far more chilling than the damp air of the well. He looked up, his gaze fixed on the shrinking circle of light above. "Percy," he called, his voice surprisingly calm, though it echoed strangely in the confined space, sounding thin and ready. Fear, when it is deep enough, when it is truly profound, sometimes manifests not as panic, but as an unnerving, almost unnatural calm. It is the calm of a man facing the inevitable, a quiet acceptance of the horror unfolding before him. Percy's head, a small, anxious silhouette, appeared over the lip of the well. "Mr. Grundy, you all right down there?" His voice, high-pitched and worried, drifted down. Thomas held up what he had found. The bone, stark white against the dark background of the well, gleamed faintly in the lantern light. He didn't need to say anything. The shape, the undeniable form, spoke for itself. Percy let out a strangled gasp, a sound halfway between a cry and a choke. His head vanished from the well opening. Thomas heard the frantic scramble of feet on the dry earth above, the sound rapidly receding into the distance. Percy ran. He ran as if the devil himself were at his heels. His youthful terror a stark contrast to Thomas's quiet, grim resolve. Thomas, however, stayed because Thomas Grundy was that kind of man. He was a man who faced what was before him, no matter how unsettling. He was a man who finished what he started, and what he had started, he now realized, was far more than just draining an old well. He began to look more carefully, his methodical nature reasserting itself, even in the face of this profound discovery. He swept the lantern beam slowly, meticulously across the entire floor. He found more bones. Not just one, but many fragments, yes, but also larger pieces clearly from multiple individuals. A small delicate rib cage too small for an adult. A femur, slender and long. A skull fragment, its curve unmistakable. They were scattered, some partially buried beneath the grit, others lying exposed on the field stones as if they had been disturbed and then settled again. This was not a single unfortunate accident. This was a burial, a clandestine, horrific burial. Then, tucked into a narrow crevice between two large field stones, almost perfectly concealed, he saw it. A small tin box no larger than a man's hand, its surface encrusted with rust and grime. It was sealed, not with a lock, but with a thick layer of hardened wax through which a bent-rusted nail had been driven, pinning the lid shut. It looked ancient, forgotten, a relic from another time. He carefully pried it free, his fingers trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the discovery. And then, as he turned to examine the box more closely, his lantern beam caught something else. Something etched directly into the field stone nearest the wall, just above where the box had been hidden. It was a carving, crude, but legible, deeply incised into the hard stone. 2 words. He had to hold the lantern very close, almost touching the stone to read them, his breath fogging slightly in the cold air. Silas Thorne. The name, stark and unyielding in the flickering light, seemed to leap out at him. He traced the letters with his finger, the rough edges of the carving, a physical manifestation of the dread that now coiled in his stomach. He did not know why that name made his stomach turn. He had never heard it before. Not in Searles Creek, not in any of the surrounding counties where he had worked. But something about finding a name, a human name, carved into the bottom of a sealed well, a well that had just yielded human remains, filled him with a profound, inexplicable dread. It was a dread that transcended reason, a primal fear that whispered of secrets too dark to comprehend, of a history deliberately erased. He carefully tied the bone fragments, the tin box, and a small piece of paper on which he had meticulously copied the carved name into his work apron. His hands, though steady, moved with a newfound urgency. He looked up at the distant circle of light, now a beacon of sanity in the suffocating darkness. "Rope!" he called, his voice louder this time, a command that echoed with the weight of his discovery. He rose out of the dark, leaving behind the cold, silent witnesses of the well's depths, carrying with him the undeniable proof that Calder's Creek held a secret far more sinister than anyone had ever dared to imagine. The quiet dread had found its voice, and it spoke in the language of bone and forgotten names. Percy, his lungs burning and his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, burst through the door of the jailhouse. The small office, usually a haven of quiet order, was momentarily thrown into chaos by his frantic entrance. Harlan Pewit, seated at his worn wooden desk, his spectacles perched on the bridge of his nose, had been meticulously filling out paperwork, a tedious complaint about a disputed fence line between two particularly cantankerous farmers, a matter of inches and decades of simmering resentment. The sudden violent intrusion of the boy, pale and gasping, his eyes wide with unadulterated terror, made Harlan drop his pen, sending a blot of ink sprawling across the official form. Constable Pewit," Percy stammered, his voice thin and ready, barely coherent. He clutched at the door frame, his knuckles white, his whole body trembling. "The well, Mr. Grundy." Here he found bones, human bones, and a name carved in the stone. The words tumbled out in a breathless, disjointed torrent, punctuated by ragged gasps for air. Harlan, ever the methodical man, rose slowly from his chair, his gaze steady and unwavering on the terrified boy. He moved with a quiet authority that often had a calming effect even in moments of crisis. "Slow down, son," he said, his voice low and even, cutting through Percy's hysteria. "Take a breath. Now tell me, from the beginning, what happened? What did Thomas Grundy find?" He led Percy to a chair, pushing it gently forward, and waited, his patience a quiet force. It took several minutes, punctuated by deep shuddering breaths and the occasional choked sob, but Harlan patiently pieced together the story: the draining of the well, Thomas's descent, the discovery of the bones, the tin box, the carved name, Percy's flight. Each fragment of information delivered in the boy's trembling voice painted an increasingly grim picture, a canvas of horror slowly taking shape in the quiet office. Harlan listened, his face impassive, but the grey eyes held a flicker of something deeper, a recognition of the gravity of the situation that transcended the boy's youthful terror. This was no stolen mule. This was something far, far worse. Harlan took his hat from the peg by the door, its familiar weight, a small comfort. "Stay here, Percy," he instructed, his voice firm. "Don't talk to anyone about this." Not yet. He knew it was a futile request. News, especially bad news, traveled faster than any horse in Searles Creek. But he had to try. The walk to the well-light was a strange, almost surreal experience. The oppressive July heat still clung to the air, but now it felt different, charged with an unspoken tension. As Harlan made his way down the dusty main street, he could feel the eyes of the town on him. Figures appeared on porches, their conversations dying abruptly as he passed. Curtains twitched in windows. The usual afternoon sounds, the distant clatter from the blacksmiths, the murmur of voices from the general store, seemed muted, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. Everyone knew something was amiss. The sight of Percy, wild-eyed and breathless, tearing through town, had been enough. The constable, walking with a grim purpose towards the old Harrow property, confirmed their worst unspoken fears. He arrived at the well site to find Thomas Grundy sitting on the stone lip of the well, a solitary figure amidst the parched earth and overgrown weeds. Thomas was smoking his pipe, a thin plume of acrid smoke curling lazily into the still air. The apron bundle, now containing the grim evidence, lay at his feet, a dark, unassuming lump. He looked up as Harlan approached, his gaze meeting the constable's without expression, his face still smudged with dirt, his eyes holding a quiet, weary knowledge. There was no triumph, no horror, just a profound, unsettling calm. "Constable," Thomas said, his voice low and growly, the words carrying the weight of what he had seen. "You'll want to look at what I brought up." Harlan knelt beside him, his movements deliberate. He untied the knot in the apron, carefully unfolding the stained canvas. The bone fragments, stark white against the dark fabric, were immediately visible. A small, delicate jawbone, a piece of a child's skull, no larger than his palm. The sight sent a cold shiver down Harlan's spine, a visceral reaction that bypassed his war-hardened composure. He had seen death countless times in its most brutal forms. But this was different. This was intimate, ancient, and deeply wrong. Next, he picked up the small tin box. Its surface was heavily corroded, but the wax seal, though cracked and discolored, was still largely intact, the bent nail holding it fast. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the weight of its contents, the unspoken history it contained. Then he looked at the piece of paper Thomas had included, the one with the meticulously copied name, Silas Thorne. The name scrolled in Thomas's careful hand seemed to hum with a silent malevolence. Harlan felt a prickle of unease, a sense of recognition he couldn't place. He had never heard that name before. Not truly, not in any context that would explain its presence at the bottom of a well filled with human remains. But it felt significant. "You said this was carved into the stone?" Harlan asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his gaze still fixed on the name. Thomas nodded, taking a slow draw from his pipe. Deeply, like someone wanted it to last. He paused, then added, "The floor of the well, Constable. It ain't natural. It's laid with field stones, and they were disturbed, like someone put these remains there deliberately and then sealed them in." Harlan's jaw tightened. This was not an accident. This was not a body that had fallen into a well. This was a crime carefully executed, meticulously concealed. The methodical part of his mind, the part that had been honed by the brutal logic of war, began to engage, sifting through the horrifying details, searching for patterns, for meaning. "Percy ran to the jail," Harlan stated, more a confirmation than a question. Thomas grunted. "Can't say I blamed the boy. Not every day you pull up a child's jawbone from a well." He looked at Harlan, his eyes holding a profound weariness. "This ain't right, Constable." "Not right at all." Harlan nodded slowly. "No, Thomas, it isn't." He stood up, brushing the dust from his trousers. "I need you to stay here. Don't let anyone near this well. I'm sending for Deputy Wofford, and I need Aldous Pitt, the town clerk. Tell him it's urgent." Thomas simply nodded, resuming his quiet vigil by the well, his pipe smoke a thin grey offering to the still heavy air. Clem wafted. Harlan's young deputy arrived first, his horse hoofed from the hurried ride. Clem was 26, eager to please, but easily frightened, his youthful enthusiasm often overshadowed by a nervous disposition. He dismounted quickly, his eyes wide with apprehension. "Constable," Percy said. His voice trailed off as he saw the apron bundle, the stark white of the bones against the dark fabric, his face already pale, drained of all color. He took one look, a quick horrified glance, and then turned abruptly, stumbling a few paces away before he bent over, retching violently into the dry grass. Harlan watched him, a flicker of grim understanding in his eyes. Clem was a good boy, but this was beyond anything he had ever encountered. He knew they were murdered, and he chose to benefit from it. He chose to build his fortune on their graves. He chose to keep the well sealed, to keep the truth buried, to protect his name, his legacy at the cost of justice, at the cost of innocent lives. Vance pushed himself up from his chair, his face flushed, his eyes blazing. My father was a businessman. He saw an opportunity. He was not present at any unfortunate incident. He simply acquired property that was legally available. He was shouting now, his voice cracking with a desperate fury. You have no proof, no witnesses. Everyone involved is dead. Except for the bones, Mayor, Harland said, his voice cutting through Vance's outburst like a surgeon's scalpel. And the documents and the memories of an old woman who refused to forget, and the conscience of a man who wrote a confession even if it was only for God. He paused, letting the full weight of his words settle. And you, Mayor, you knew. You watched that well for 40 years. You pushed for it to be filled, not excavated. You warned all disprove it. You are complicit. Vance sank back into his chair, his shoulders slumping, the fight draining out of him. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. He looked suddenly old, defeated. The carefully constructed facade had crumbled, revealing the terrified, guilty man beneath. He stared at Harlan, his gaze distant, as if seeing not the constable, but the ghosts of the past, the shadows of the Harrow family, the cold, accusing eyes of Silas Thorne. I never heard anyone constable, Vance said, his voice barely a whisper, devoid of its former arrogance, filled instead with a profound, chilling weariness. Not personally. I just never stopped anything either. I wonder sometimes how different that really is. The words hung in the air, a haunting admission of passive complicity, of moral failing that had allowed a monstrous crime to remain unpunished for decades. Harlan looked at him, not with triumph, but with a deep, unsettling sadness. Vance was not a monster in the way Silas Thorne had been, or even in the way Reverend Fitch had been. He was something in some ways more troubling. A man who had inherited a crime, decided the cost of justice was too high, and spent his entire life managing the consequences, burying the truth deeper and deeper until the earth itself had finally rebelled. Harlan reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. The cold metal glinted in the lamplight. Elias Vance, he said, his voice firm. Official. I am arresting you on charges of obstruction of justice and conspiracy to conceal a capital crime. Vance offered no resistance. He simply held out his wrists, his eyes fixed on some distant unseen point. It was a thin charge. Harlan knew it might not hold. The crimes were 40 years old. The principals were dead, and Vance's family name still carried enormous weight in the county. Both men knew it. But Harlan filed the papers anyway. The truth once unearthed, demanded its due, no matter how imperfect the justice. The silence of Sears Creek had been broken, and the reckoning had finally begun. In the weeks that followed the confrontation between Harlan Puett and Elias Vance, the truth about the Harrow family and the old well came apart and came together in the way that truths always do when they have been buried for 40 years. Not cleanly, not all at once, but in fragments, each one harder to absorb than the last. The initial shock gave way to a slow, agonizing process of digestion, a collective reckoning that rippled through every corner of Sears Creek. The remains, carefully exhumed from the well, were transported to Knoxville for formal examination by a physician, Dr. Alistair Finch, a man of science and grim experience. His report, delivered with a detached professionalism that belied the horror of its contents, confirmed Harlan's suspicions. 5 of the 6 sets of remains were consistent with a family group, a man, a woman, and 3 children of varying ages. The 6th set, however, was consistent with a large adult male whose skeletal structure indicated a powerful build. Dr. Finch noted the healed fractures on the forearms, suggesting a history of physical trauma, and most chillingly, the single devastating blow to the posterior cranium, which had been the cause of death. This was significant. The 6th man in the well was not a victim in the same way the Hargroves had been. He was the instrument of their destruction, of the hand that had wrought their suffering, and yet, in a cruel twist, someone had placed him there afterward. Obadiah Fitch's partial confession, signed with the initials OAF, took on an entirely new meaning under this light. These letters did not belong to a passive witness or a remorseful bystander. They belonged to a man who had taken the only action he felt remained. He had delivered a grim, final justice. Reverend Fitch, a man of God, had not merely confessed to wrongdoing. He had acted on it. He had hunted down Silas Thorne, the monster he had once unleashed upon the town, and killed him. Then, in a grim ritual of concealment, he had buried Thorne alongside his victims, sealing all six in the suffocating darkness of the well. Fitch carried this burden alone for 18 years, dying of a fever in 1851. Not a single soul in Sears Creek had ever understood the full weight of his actions, nor why the mere whisper of wind over a well could drive him from a room, pale and trembling with fear. When the county prosecutor, Jeremiah Blackwood, reviewed the case, he found the charges against Elias Vance obstruction of justice and conspiracy to conceal a capital crime thin and tenuous. As Harlan had predicted, Vance was released on his own recognizance, pending further review. Yet time was not on the side of justice. The crimes were decades old. The principal actors were dead, and Vance's family name, despite the revelations, carried immense weight in the county. Harlan had filed the charges unaware not for a guaranteed conviction, but for principle, for record, for truth. Agnes Dira, upon learning the full account of the six skeletons, Silas Thorne's true identity, and the new interpretation of Fitch's confession, sat in quiet contemplation for a long time. On her porch, hands folded in her lap, she seemed heavy with exhaustion yet also oddly at peace. "Luther knew," she said softly, eyes distant, fixed on the shimmering heat above the creek. "He just didn't know all of it. And I think not knowing all of it our broken bar that was the only mercy any of us ever had." Her words captured the bitter duality of truth, its terrible weight, and the fragile consolation found in ignorance. The people of Sears Creek responded in the ways small towns often do to shattering revelations, as some with raw grief, others with furious denial, and many attempting a kind of moral bargaining. The elders, who had once known the Harrows personally, grieved with vivid intensity. They remembered Clara and Edmund, their children playing in dusty streets, shared meals, and whispered blessings in the church pews. Guilt and shame mingled with sorrow as suppressed memories flooded back. Others resisted the truth fiercely. They murmured that Harlan Pewit was stirring trouble, that Agnes Dira was senile, that the bones were merely a long-forgotten burial site, anything to avoid confronting the horror beneath their town.